Having just heard about our #1 status makes me think maybe we should do an 8 clap this morning, but we'll save that for a little bit later. So a retail tsunami, not to be overly dramatic, but I think we're just seeing we're in a period of time of just unprecedented disruption and change, and I'm pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you here this morning, both in my remarks and then also with, I think, a really dynamic panel that'll be fun to discuss this further. So kind of 4 things I'll touch on. First is why now? I think many of us can remember 15, 18 years ago, there was a lot of enthusiasm around e-commerce, and so what's different today versus then? Second, talk about what do I think is out there in terms of who are going to be the winners and who's going to be most challenged. How big and how fast really is all of this likely to unfold, and how significant will be the implications? And then talk a little bit about courses of action, whether you're directly involved in retail or just in general, because obviously the changes that are happening in technology and that's influencing is having profound impact on the retail sector, but I don't think there's any sector that is immune to what's unfolding in the economy right now. But just to kick this off, I'll take us back to and kind of remind us, and it's sort of staggering to think back that, early 1999, NASDAQ's at 2,000, and 18 months later it's at 5,000. I mean, we went through this incredible time where there was so much excitement about the internet and e-commerce and what it could turn into, and we remember, what happened not long after that. This is another just really interesting reminder of 10 companies that had, $2.7 billion of capital raised that evaporated within a very short period after that time. You think about, what were the darlings in the media and what was being talked about, and companies like Napster and others that, again, had a very short cycle to them. And also, just as a reminder, this isn't the first time, and it's not totally new, the idea of, how about if we get delivered at home? Wouldn't that be convenient? And yet, with all that as context, the reality is we really are starting to get, real serious traction, and we all recognize that, and we see that in our daily lives. And so some of the questions as to why now. Well, one is we're seeing critical competencies really being achieved in terms of the scale, the breadth of assortment, the speed with which we have access, and the efficiency with which things are being done. We've reached that critical competency point at which it was very different than where the marketplace was in kind of the days of e-com 1.0 at the turn of the century. Second is a very different consumer today, and I think the recession was not only significant in the 08-09 period in terms of just the economic hardship of it, but I think more than we had seen in any other recession was the psychological impact it had on consumers. And I think that has been quite sticky. And consumers became much more conscientious about how and where they spent and what they spent on. And as a result of that, thinking very differently about what they want to do. The array of choices that consumers have available to them is much more vast than what was true not that long behind that. And then along with those two huge changes is the unfolding of the smartphone, which really is the killer app that I think has been the biggest change that has unlocked this period that we've gone into. And I know we all are attached to our phones. I've heard that the average person looks at their smartphone 150 times a day, spends over 3 hours on their smartphone, and we just take it for granted. It's such an ubiquitous part of our lives today. But this really is what I think has unlocked the power of e-commerce, and as we all know, it's the 10-year anniversary of the iPhone. That's a relatively short period of time, and we're just now, I think, really unlocking just how significant this can be in terms of the transactions and what goes on in our lives. So with that, I think we're entering really a fourth industrial revolution. And I think that history is going to look back on this period of time as the most extraordinary period of change, disruption, and reinvention. And as we look at retail's evolution over the last 50 years, certainly the introduction of the suburban shopping mall was a huge change from how people had shopped previously. And we've seen other incremental steps forward that have included big box retail, and then from there, certainly vertical retail, where retailers were sourcing directly from factories. And each of those were incremental, interesting modifications of how consumers went about their shopping. But in my opinion, it was about 5 years ago that the direct-to-consumer model really began to be talked about and unlocked. And I think history will look back and see that as the most sweeping change that has affected retail at any time over really, I think history. So with that, undoubtedly, we're facing a period of winners and losers. And as I'll talk more about, I think unfolding rather quickly. But broadly speaking, who would I think the winners? Number one is the consumer. We all as consumers have more access to more assortment, more choice. We have more control over price, over speed, and timing, and the ease. We can shop wherever we want, whenever we want, for whatever we want, and then we can get it delivered to us with that same amount of flexibility. So the consumers are huge winners through this, and it's really a massive shift of power to the consumer away from the retailers who controlled so much of the market over history. Second is for top brands. My career, I've been both on the branded side with Vans as well as the retail side with PacSun. And one of the things about a brand up until recently was you always had to work through the retailer, and you're always fighting for shelf space and how to be more important. And then for whatever reason, if they had, their problems were your problems, and if you didn't solve it, well, then they found somebody else that would. And it was always incredibly competitive to get shelf space. Well, now those top brands have the opportunity to just take their message directly to consumers. And oh, by the way, one of the things that I don't think is talked enough about in the business press is the margin implications of being able to sell direct. So I think huge upside for top brands as this unfolds. Thirdly, as I say, a limited number of truly distinctive retailers, and that word distinctive has never been more important. And then I think certainly there's never been a more exciting time to be an entrepreneur. And I think for ambitious, well-educated millennials and Gen Z, if they have the opportunity to go to the #1 public university in the US, I think it'll be pretty amazing what we see this next generation do. Fortunately for them, they've grown up with this technology. Sadly, I think to some degree, you hear stories about the reality is 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, they're quite proficient with smartphones and iPads before they learn to read. And I think the implications of that sociologically are going to be really significant, and I think get a lot more attention in the years ahead. But they're the ones who've grown up with it, they're going to get educated about it, and their careers will be entirely built around this new reality. Having said that, I got to put in a quick plug for Anderson and other top business schools. And one of my good friends is here because he's re-enrolled because it's a time of so much change that I think the top business schools have a huge opportunity and a really important responsibility to play in helping educate the workforce on how to adapt to the very rapid changes that are taking place. But if we want to talk about who's really going to win, who's going to be the UCLA retail, I think it's pretty obvious. What Amazon is doing is really quite remarkable. And in many ways, and I know their market cap's not there yet. I think their market cap's only about $450 billion right now. But I think it's fair to say the $640 billion question is just how ubiquitous, how far, how intrinsic into our lives is Amazon going to become in the years ahead. And they really are kind of what I like to say, they are the new mall and department store on steroids. And they bring everything that a mall and a department store were originally designed to do in terms of breadth, of assortment, of convenience, selection, information, but it's all at our fingertips whenever we want it, 24/7. And then, oh, by the way, they can deliver it with unprecedented speed, and their prices are pretty darn competitive as well. Add to that all that they have and continue to reinvest in technology and artificial intelligence, in logistics, and their incredible access to capital. And they are an unbelievable competitor and more than just a change agent, the likes of which I can't think of a parallel at any time in history or in any other industry, which is both exciting as well as frightening at the same time. When you look at kind of the scope of Amazon and what they reach, I mean, I think one of the things that's at times lost on people, they have more than 70,000 other businesses that sell through Amazon. So they don't report that full revenue because it's not their revenue, but it's a huge part of the economic engine and reach that Amazon has. Over 50% of the population, and this number keeps growing and the distance keeps shortening. So if we wonder why, God, how is it that I can order that at midnight and it shows up at 11 a.m.? Well, this is why, and they've designed everything with that objective. And they have over 80 million Prime members, and that number continues to grow. And here's a staggering statistic from what I have heard and been told is the typical conversion rate in e-commerce is somewhere between 1.5% to 4%. My belief and what I've been told is that Amazon has a 70% conversion rate for Prime customers when they go online. Is just off the charts in terms of how powerful that base of customers is and the implications of that. And what are the results? The results are unbelievable. More than 50% of the e-commerce growth in the US in totality, more than 50% of that for each of the last 2 years has been gobbled up by Amazon. And think about all the other retailers, all the other e-commerce sites, all the brands that sell direct, and more than 50% of all the growth of the last 2 years has been directly through Amazon. And the result is more than 1/3 of online sales are through Amazon. Pretty staggering. Will there be survivors? Yes, there'll be survivors. But it's a shorter and shorter list. And that's why I say really distinctive retailers. But they too are going to continue to need to be nimble and really smart about how they differentiate themselves. So then let's talk about who's going to be challenged. The first group to me are kind of the aggregator retailers. And to some degree, even PacSun was one of those, that sit kind of in the middle of the market and that a fair bit of the business is based on other brands and pulling those together in a place that's convenient. Now you got to wake up every morning and look in the mirror and say, wait a second, what's the breadth of my assortment compared to Amazon? What's my convenience? How compelling is it really that I have to offer? And so I think we're going to continue to see a huge chunk of the market be quite challenged. Second, mall owners that, when regional malls were started back 30, 40 years ago and became such an important part of our lifestyle, why was it? Well, it was their breadth of selection. It was they were convenient. Gosh, I need to try things on. And it was also a meeting place for teens that they could plan on Wednesday. We'll meet at the mall at 1 o'clock on Saturday. Now, if any of you have teens, you realize that they make their plans for 1 o'clock on Saturday at about 12:55 on Saturday, and they change about 18 times between then and 1 o'clock because, of course, of their smartphone. So Gen X, again, I think that people that are in their 30s and 40s and have been trained and have developed their careers based on kind of the old economy, going to be challenged making that transition. And then, as was alluded to this morning, first-time job seekers, I thought it was a very insightful comment that was made, that the opportunities to get trained in retail, sadly, are going to be less and less going forward and not easily replaced. And those part-time jobs in high school and in college and places to learn, it's not clear what those opportunities are going to be for people going forward. So when you think about trends that would you bet on, drones and faster delivery, or pressure from higher minimum wage, just at a time when retail is already quite challenged. So think back 10 years ago when the iPhone was created. What were the names and brands that were so much a part of our life, and how many of these have gone away? I mean, Newsweek magazine, the Yellow Pages, things that were such institutions have now been overcome by the new economy and digital media and e-commerce replacing these. So I got to take a pause for a moment. 46-0, you're thinking, well, boy, is Gary predicting Saturday's football game? I'd like to think that I am. But actually, interestingly, I had the chance to participate in one of the Anderson classes last spring, and was with a group of students, and we were talking about a retail case, and then a little bit of Q&A. One of the students asked, well, yeah, but retail, do you really think that e-commerce is going to have that much impact on retail? Because don't we all still like to try on our clothes, and aren't we going to continue to go to stores? So I said to the class, all right, well, let's see by a show of hands, how many of you have bought clothing online? Well, here's your answer. 46 raised their hand, and none hadn't. They say that over 70% of millennials spend more than 25% of their dollars now on clothing online. And I think that percentage is only going to increase and is going to accelerate. So I think there are very few sectors of retail that are immune to what's happening. Why do I put this up? Well, one is I always struggled with calculus, but I figured if I could put up a slide about calculus in a business school, that's worth something, right? But I put this up because based on my own experience, I feel like last holiday season was actually a critical tipping point in terms of how big really is this disruption going to be. A lot of people going into last holiday had felt that e-commerce penetration, which was in the mid-teens, was going to start to level out. And the reality was the opposite, that there was further acceleration in adoption of e-commerce in the holiday season, which, by the way, is the biggest time of year in retail. And the reason they call it Black Friday is because in the old days, you lost money for 11 months. And then when the day after Thanksgiving came, it was finally the beginning of making money in a month. So holiday is incredibly important for every retailer. And the idea that in 2016, e-commerce was still accelerating at holiday, and FedEx and UPS still couldn't add enough airplanes to deliver out to people what they needed. And if you walked into a regional mall anytime between 2 days after Black Friday until about the 22nd of December, malls were pretty quiet in what historically has been the biggest month of the year by far. So for me, as I think back to calculus is all about the rate of change, right? And what I felt was the rate of change is actually still accelerating, which I think speaks volumes to where is this all really headed. So to look more specifically at the retail environment, to win versus Amazon, I think two things you got to ask yourself. Do I have a differentiated assortment, and or do I have a differentiated experience? And unfortunately, I think if we look at most of retail in the mall today, struggle to really argue that they win on either of those dimensions, and it's very few that I think can win on both dimensions. So I think the scale of disruption and the scale of the market that Amazon can go after, I think is massive. And the slide that was up this morning that showed where is retail versus what's happened in manufacturing, I think was a very provocative slide. And I do worry about employment declines in retail becoming pretty significant in the years ahead. So why is it so big and happening so fast? Part of it is because both the retail business and the mall business, they're fixed cost businesses. And the idea of losing 3, 4, 5% of our traffic year after year after year, that just is not sustainable. We're not in businesses that can handle that easily. And therefore, the pressure, I think, is going to be profound, and the change that's going to continue to unfold in a short period of time, I believe, is going to be quite dramatic. So what's ahead? What's coming? Those who are true category leaders, who have figured out to optimize their retail space, and have a real omni-channel operation, I think those will survive. A brand like Nordstrom that I think dominates the higher end of the market, but also has a strong history of direct to customers through their catalog business, that's invested heavily in e-commerce for more than the last 10 years, and only has about 100 stores across the country, I continue to believe is very well positioned. And a company like Costco and Walmart with their low pricing, and there will be a few really prominent retailers that will absolutely continue to be important in the marketplace. But that list is going to shrink. I believe online will approach or exceed 50% of sales in many categories. Some think that more categories are going to be immune. I personally don't think so. And I think the winners and losers for the next decade are going to be determined within the next 12, 24, 36 months. I think it's going to become increasingly evident who are those short lists that really have something distinctive versus the rest of our household spending. As Amazon gets closer to having 100 million Prime members, that is just a huge amount of retail spending that then is going to continue to get sucked away, and I think very few are going to be able to withstand that. Similarly, I think in malls, I think it's well understood that B and C malls are going to largely have to transform themselves, if not go away, to other real estate uses. And hopefully some of you in this room will help figure out what those solutions can be it housing, be it commercial or something else. So this, I think, helps tie this all together. It's quite possible that by 2020, total revenue at Amazon, including the independent companies that sell through Amazon, actually could exceed all of the regional malls across the country. That is kind of mind-blowing. And if it takes until 2021 or 2022, the significance of that, I think, still is not lost on any of us. So let's just look at just days to continue to emphasize this point about how dramatic and how quickly is this unfolding. First, Walmart, which up until I think only a couple days ago is when it actually went live, never sold anywhere else. You went to one of 4,000 Walmart superstores to get Walmart goods. Well, as of a couple of days ago, now Google Express. Why'd they do that? Because they want to compete with Amazon, and they see it lining themselves with Google, which also has created deals with Target and Costco, that together that's creating critical mass that probably is the second alternative and creates sort of that small group oligopoly that I think is what we're going to see going forward. Nordstrom, you probably heard about 2 weeks ago, announced they're opening a store. The first one is going to be here in West Hollywood, a 3,000 square foot store with no merchandise. Who would imagine that as recently as 12 or 24 months ago? But now it's like, ooh, that's interesting. That seems to make a lot of sense. Kohl's in the last 10 days announced that they're going to accept Amazon returns, which is really interesting that they think getting Amazon's headaches could maybe help drive traffic to their stores. And we laughed. The stock market went up, thought it's an interesting idea, but I think it's a high-risk, highly unproven idea. And having operated retail stores, I can't imagine what that's going to do to the psyche of the employees there. When somebody comes in with their frying pan that they don't like from Amazon and, well, let me take that for you. And by the way, make sure you go see, our jeans that are on sale. And then Toys R Us, historically bankruptcies happened, and I've lived through one after holiday. Toys R Us just had to announce their bankruptcy, which tells me that vendors weren't willing to supply them for this Christmas season. And they were forced to go into Chapter 11 before Christmas, which is almost unprecedented. This is all just in the last 30 days with 4 of the biggest retailers on the planet. And each one of these things in and of themselves is really a provocative statement. To have all of these happening, I think underscores how big and how fast. Real big and real fast, I think, is the answer. And if we need any reminders in terms of just globally how much things are changing, who would have imagined 18 months ago you'd have 2 complete political novices now as leaders of 2 really important countries in the planet, in the US and France. And at the same time, the vote on Brexit wasn't supposed to go this way. So we live in a really unpredictable time where change is absolutely abundant, and the implications are really dramatic and profound. And I think as humans, we're conditioned to not be as influenced by change. And I think part of what we need to do is actually recognize just how dramatic of a period of time we live in and get our heads around the rate at which change is actually occurring. And now is killer app number 2, which seems interesting, seems novel, looks kind of cute, it's kind of fun. But I think we're going to find the battle for the home and the implication of that almost as significant as the smartphone. And again, I think for bricks and mortar retail is just going to become that much more challenging. So, call to action. Therefore, what do you do? I think as a retailer, you got to answer the question for real. How are you different and better than Amazon? And if you can't answer that, then you got to think really hard about what do you do about that. Why does the customer need you? What is it that you have to offer? And you better answer either we've got an incredibly focused assortment, and therefore the simplicity of that focus is why the customer shops you. You bring innovation to your category and or a really distinctive experience that the customer says, yeah, I know I'm a Prime member, but I still want to experience your store in your category. But it better be some very specific, tangible reasons. Otherwise, I think going to be really challenging. Have to be a true omni-channel operation. Have to be integrated. Need to know everything about your customer. Physical store, online, what they tried on, whether it was in their shopping cart, what they tried on in the fitting room. And we hear a lot about big data. And at Anderson, there's some really exciting things being done around teaching of how to utilize and access big data. But doing that is not inexpensive, not at all, but it's going to be a requirement going forward. Thirdly, something I've always believed in, you got to answer the question and you got to satisfy the customer of on the paradigm of love versus like, meaning if they love either what you provide or how you go about doing it, then you'll hold a place in their hearts and you'll hold a place in their wallets. If they only like today is a really tough place to compete, because not only does Amazon give them an alternative, but then you're competing against everything else they like, which ranges from a spin class to an acai bowl to a cold pressed juice to going on a trip to the Amazon. So you got to operate in a place where the consumer loves what you do for them. And lastly, you got to turn your customers into passionate advocates. And I think the retailers that'll succeed going forward are going to absolutely just be maniacally focused on all four of those dimensions. As far as landlords, and you'll hear more from Art this afternoon, and landlords is a very broad term, and there's all kinds of different landlords. For companies like Macerich and Westfield that have really world-class malls, they're in a little different place than sort of the broad perception. So when I speak landlords, I'm speaking very broadly. I think it's obvious, and it's not just B and C malls, but it's also a lot of street locations. They're going to be challenged, and people are going to have to think about repurposing that space. Pressure on rents is going to be inevitable because, by definition, there just isn't going to be the same traffic and the same spending power in many of those locations. Somebody mentioned Westfield and Century City. That's an amazing property, and they certainly doubled down on that investment. But that isn't going to be the answer for probably 90% of the retail space out there today. And I think there's got to be a continued evolution. The reality is there's gotten to be a lot of sameness, and I think that sameness is going to be dramatically reduced, and it's going to require innovative thinking to replace that retail space. For the rest of us that aren't directly in these businesses, I would share a few thoughts. One is to engage in the digital world, even if it's not stuff that you normally do. Amazon, Google, Facebook, make them part of your lives because they are the industry beacons of the future, and we need to know what they're up to. We need to understand that because their reach is dramatic. And it can't just be things that our kids are doing, but we don't really do that. We still do things the old way. Doesn't mean you have to spend all your money there, but engage with that. Secondly, embrace the young people in our organizations. They are living this, and there's not a parallel in the past. In history, the young people need to come in and be the apprentices and learn and then take their place over time. It's so different what's happening with technology, and there's so many new things that are accessing. Tap into the young people in our organizations because they've got their fingers on all these new opportunities that are unfolding and the implications of them. They're going to understand quicker than some of us are. And then lastly, let yourself imagine, what might I 5 years from now look back and say, God, if only I'd have known that for sure in 2017. Let yourself go to that place. And some might say, well, that's kind of a dark place. And maybe don't spend too much time there, but let yourself get to that place and imagine how profound, and ask yourselves the questions, how big and how fast. And you might very well look back and thank yourself for having done so, because I think the winners will also be those who embrace a mindset of how big and how fast, and then figure out for their own businesses what the implications are now, rather than trying to figure out when it's too late. So I think history is going to look back, and as we think about visionaries like Galileo and Mandela, I really think Jeff Bezos will be the guy, and there have been a lot of really innovative business leaders throughout our history. But I think what he's done and what he's created at Amazon and what he envisioned and just his consistent, persistent commitment to a long-term strategy, I think history is going to look back and say probably unmatched in his vision as well as his impact. But then if you ask me, who's maybe the smartest guy that I know, I think it's the guy who cuts my hair, David at LaBelle Hair Salon, right here in Westwood. He's been cutting my hair since 1980, and every time I go see him, pretty regularly every 6 weeks, I'm due to go see him. I said, David, any hint that Amazon's getting into the haircut business? And he keeps saying no. And I think he's going to be right. So thanks very much. Appreciate being here.